And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, powering Africa's potential from ground to grid. Proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025. Good evening. Welcome to the program. Well, you may have enjoyed the public holiday yesterday, but an awful lot going on in the meantime, of course. And part of it around Sipho Pityana. You'll hear from him in just a moment. And he's won what I think could turn out to be quite an important ruling against the Prudential Authority. I do wonder if there'll be an appeal from the Prudential Authority or not. I mean, and it gets to the heart of the question of whether any kind of informality is allowed in making decisions about who gets to run a bank. He was in the running to be the chair of Absa, and then essentially after informal conversations in which he was not able to sort of state his view or state his case, he did not get the job. It's quite a messy, complicated, difficult story in many ways, but I do wonder if the Prudential Authority is going to just perhaps actually, try and appeal this in some way. Busisiwe Mavuso is the head of Business Leadership South Africa. Very strong words from her today for the unions involved at Transnet last week, and it's one of those stories that you might have missed because so many other things were happening. But essentially, the unions at Transnet are getting an 18% increase over the next 3 years. Now, inflation's at 3%. If I were a unionist, I would say, but Stephen, since the pandemic, food prices went up by more than inflation. More people are unemployed. We needed to look after more people. Busisiwe Mavuso, I think you know this, sees it differently. She says that they do not have our economic prospects at heart, because essentially it just makes it harder and harder and harder to fix Transnet to get everything running. There's an interesting debate to have there. I wonder which side of it you're on. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, late on Friday, an important ruling that seems to show the former head of the Prudential Authority, Kuben Naidu, was wrong to communicate with Maria Ramos and Wendy Lucas-Bill to ask them about claims of sexual harassment against Sipho Pityana. Pityana was a member of the board of Absa and seems to have been the only candidate for the position of chair. But when he resigned from Anglo Gold Ashanti over the claims against him when they emerged, he was not appointed to the job at Absa and eventually forced out. He's now won a High Court ruling saying that because he was not allowed to respond to the claims against him, he was treated unfairly. And as a result, the Prudential Authority, it appears, may not have done its job properly. Sipho Pityana joins us now. He is, of course, a former member of a former chair of Anglo Gold Ashanti, and as you know, a prominent person in South African business. Sipho, good evening. I imagine you must have felt quite vindicated on Friday.
Stephen, good evening to you and your listeners. Yes, indeed. Very pleased and welcome the ruling, which in part it is pleasing to the extent that it is a vindication of my character, but it raises very serious issues of governance in relation to the financial services environment, and indeed abuse of state institution, which I think that should be a cause for concern.
When you say abuse, do you think people were acting because they were against you, or could they not have be a more innocent explanation? They may have been wrong to act in the way they did, but they had an innocent motive. It wasn't about you. It was about protecting banking in South Africa.
Well, Steve, I have the leadership of the Reserve Bank are people that I've known for many, many years. They are people who've displayed incredibly competent character and professionalism in the way they do their work. This is not a matter where people didn't know how to deal with a matter of nomination of somebody to be a director of a board or to be a public officer of a bank. And by the way, in my over 20 years on serving on boards in the private sector, in 2 instances, I've had to go through this. This was the 3rd instance. I'd never seen anything like it. In the earlier instances, the way in which my consideration for directorship of a board was exactly as the judge said. I mean, the processes are prescribed in law. There's a regulatory instrument that is used to guide officials at the Reserve Bank on what to do, what questions to ask, what information to source. It's called BA 020. And it's very clear there that if you may have been convicted either through a disciplinary process or a court of law or any number of transgressions, you must disclose those. And indeed, then that becomes a basis for an inquiry by the Reserve Bank to get to the bottom of that if the bank or financial services institution that would have appointed you didn't do its work. In this instance, I mean, I was probed around unsubstantiated claims of sexual harassment, to which I fully cooperated and gave access to any information that you can think of, including access to towers for my cell phone to show my whereabouts and all of that, and to be treated as if I'd been convicted of sexual harassment by the Prudential Authority was incredible, and then lead them to conclude basically that I was not a fit and proper person, and in the way they communicated to the Absa leadership was completely scurrilous abuse of authority.
As I understand it, what happened was, and this is how the judgment sort of sets it out, which is that Maria Ramos and Wendy Lucas-Bill were both at Absa at the time. Kuben Naidu, who was the head of the Prudential Authority, first phoned Maria Ramos. She told him to make a proper request for information. Then he didn't do that, as the judgment explains. He phoned Wendy Lucas-Bill, and things went from there. Do you believe he was acting on his own? Has he got some animus or ill feeling towards you? Could this be a common practice in the Prudential Authority to make, I mean, in English they use the word soundings, to have informal conversations about people?
No, I mean, by the way, Maria Ramos was at Anglo Gold Ashanti, not at Absa at the time.
My mistake.
And she was fully behind accusation of sexual harassment against me, which she actually manufactured. I would talk about that. I think I spoke to you about this at some point in your
interview. You did, yes.
In a different context. But I don't think that's what the issue is. I mean, the issue is that the relationship between Maria Ramos and Kuben Naidu is what saw Maria exploit that relationship and Kuben being an accomplice. And unfortunately, other governors of the Reserve Bank who met and considered the matter and agreed with Kuben that they may not support my nomination. Here's the issue here with regard to this, is that, you know, the law allows them to probe anything that they want in terms of the regulation. The reason they didn't follow the law is because the law and the regulations don't require them to investigate in the kind of way that they did a matter that was not more than an accusation. There was a competent legal opinion by Peter Harris, a highly respected human rights lawyer in South Africa of incredibly high pedigree, who wrote that these allegations you may not use against Pityana because they whatever investigation Absa did was flawed. So you then dismiss that. Absa, to its credit, asked Peter Harris to do this investigation, and then shared the report with the Prudential Authority and said, on the basis of this feedback and this due diligence that we've done, we remain confident that this man is the right person to lead the bank as the chairman of the board. Without any form of inquiry, without even inquiring with me as a person that they were concerned about, and saying to me that Maria tells us this, what do you say about it? They decided that no. We don't care what you think. We will not have him as the chair of that board if you were to recommend him. And of course, the Absa board took a view that they were not going to pick up a fight with the Reserve Bank over that.
Kuben Naidu is no longer at the Prudential authorities at Investec now. Do you think this kind of practice still goes on? I mean, is it common? Was it just one or two people?
Well, I think that it's in my view, when I read the papers that they submitted to the courts, they seem to believe that it's perfectly acceptable for them to do this. And there's nothing wrong that they've done. Wrongly, they quote Basel, which surprised me that they don't understand what the Basel regulations mean, because they are supposed to be guided by those in providing oversight. So if they interpret them in the way that they did, it suggests a high level of incompetence, not only on Kuben's part, but on the governor's colleagues that is with the Reserve Bank. And also cites the Financial Sector Regulations Authority as the basis for this. No piece of law or regulation, international or local, permits them to violate South African laws governing how they should regulate banks. So in my view, this was not somebody who didn't understand how these things work, but had a commitment to deliver to a Maria Ramos, who is a known friend and former colleague of his, who've got close associations of various kinds. So this was a buddy thing, and you use a highly regarded and respectable independent institution in our economy to serve the interests of a particular individual who's pursuing a vendetta, if you like, against me. That is no different from using government institutions to pursue your political opponents or your opponents in many other ways. It is scandalous.
Sipho Pityana, thank you. The former chair at AngloGold Ashanti, as you know, a long track record in South African business. Now, earlier today, we did not make a call to the Prudential Authority on the grounds that, in my experience, they were very unlikely to comment on this at this stage. Bear in mind, there is still the prospect of an appeal. Based on the comments, though, from Sipho Pityana, I've already communicated with my team, and I think tomorrow we will certainly put in calls to the Prudential Authority, and I think perhaps to Kuben Naidu in his own capacity as well. There might be one or two other people we need to contact as well to make sure they get a chance to reply to the claims made by Sipho Pityana there.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, the US President Donald Trump saying this afternoon that he wants what he calls a real end to the conflict between Iran and Israel. Israel's continuing its attacks on Iran. Some civilians are leaving Tehran. Iran has fired some drones and missiles into Israel, but markets obviously concerned Iran may try to block the Straits of Hormuz and thus choke global oil supplies. Professor Abel Eerstehuizen is in the Department of Strategic Studies at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor, good evening. Israel is clearly the military power in the region. What options does Iran have to try and respond to these attacks?
Yeah, I think responding to the attacks is an existential problem for the Iranians. And the question is, I think, how to broaden their response. They have a specific response to Israel, but the question is how to broaden the response. And why do they want to broaden the response? They want to broaden the response to put pressure and to use external and third parties to put pressure on Israel. So I think there are three critical issues that one has to consider here. The first is that the petroleum and the oil industry is a critical and a strategic industry in the Middle East. It's a sort of a common denominator, and it's an industry where Israel is on the outside and where all the Gulf states, all the Middle East states, all the Arab Sunni and Muslim, Sunni and Shiite states do have an interest in. So it combines that part of the Arab Sunni world. Then one has to keep in mind here that both China and India are primarily importing their oil from Iran. They are, in a way, depending on the imports of oil from Iran, and I think that's an important factor that one has to consider. And then Russia. Russia is to benefit from a higher oil price, and we've already seen the Americans, in a way, weaponizing the oil industry in the last couple of weeks with a lot of pressure to keep the oil price as low as possible in an effort to put pressure on the Russian economy. And so, the question, of course, now, how should the Iranians go about doing this? How do they go about weaponizing the petro industry?
Is it useful, even if you don't do anything, threaten to do it? Just the fact that you have the power to do it must be quite useful in a conflict like this.
Well, of course, there's the threat to do it. That's always part of your strategy. I think that's a critical factor. The other reality, of course, Stephen, and this is sort of a question mark for me hanging in the air, is the extent to which Israel will actually contributes to weaponizing the oil industry through their attacks on the Iranian oil industry. In a way, they are already playing into the hands of the Iranians by doing that. But I think, there's also, as you've noticed, the disrupting of the Strait of Hormuz. That's a critical issue, and I think, that would immediately call in and call on the response from the Americans. We've seen in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s how the Americans have responded militarily to that disruption, because I think about 30% of the world's oil is running through that Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis. So that is an important naval choke point for the petro industry in the world.
There's a lot of talk in the US, I think, and perhaps to the right of the US, about removing this Iranian regime. There's a Reuters piece suggesting that many of the people around Ayatollah Khamenei have now been killed, and he's becoming more isolated. It seems pretty clear, but I say this through the eyes of primarily Western media, that Iran's regime is not that popular. But is that really realistic by Israel and the US to try and have some kind of regime change? It did not end well in Iraq and in many other places.
Yeah, I would be cautious to use that as a primary focus area. I always jokingly make the point that it is their democratic right to be undemocratic. I know that sounds in a way a dichotomy in a way, but it is really their choice to be undemocratic, and it is their choice to have the government they have. But I would also want to argue that regime change, in my opinion, featured prominently in the Israeli military action against the Iranians. I have no doubt about that. And if one then keep in mind that what the Israelis have done, they have done with the Americans knowing about it, and with the Americans probably contributing to it, then I think the idea of regime change indeed have featured very prominently both in Israel and in America on the strategic agenda. I have no doubt about it. The question is, and this we have seen it in all the wars that we have seen the Americans trying to do this in the last 50 years. The chances that they will be successful is slim. They've been successful in Libya, but what they've created in Libya in the aftermath of the regime change is really not what you want to have in Iran at the moment.
Professor Abel Eerstehuizen, thank you so much, from the Department of Strategic Studies at the University of Stellenbosch.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Kwena Maloko is with Equity Research Sales at Absa CIB. Kwena, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in. Well, let's pick up on the situation in Iran. Obviously, markets focused on that pretty much everywhere.
I mean, that's right, Stephen. Friday was a big day. Volumes across the board, very, very high. But I mean, today, if you just look at the commodity markets, that seems to imply that the conflict is at least regional for now, right? So the gold price keeps selling off from sort of highs of, let's call it 34.50 per ounce. It's about 33.80 when I left the office. But the oil price continues after 2 days of very, very strong prices. We're now at, let's call it $75 per barrel of Brent. That's then taken Sasol all the way up to 100, right? So Sasol is probably year to date in the positive territory now, and all of those gains have been made up in the last couple of weeks.
I mean, it's quite nice for Sasol because they've had a rough time. Suddenly they had a sort of a kind of a re-announcement of a transformation. Then this comes along. I mean, it's helped them nicely.
Exactly. I mean, since the Capital Markets Day, we've seen the share just go from strength to strength. But where you are seeing a little bit of concern in the equity market is through MTN, right? The stock is down 4% today, almost 5% actually, to 126. And I think that's primarily because they do own 40% of Iran Cells, so effectively a mobile network operator in Iran. And while the market generally doesn't ascribe a lot of value to the business in most times, I think this is just a reflection of some of the concerns of being involved in an area where there's a lot of conflict.
It's a reminder of how something happening far away can really affect the JSE and affect us in ways we don't always understand.
100%. And not just through the equities, right? I mean, ZAR was trending down into the 1760s at one point. We're back around sort of 19, but volumes have normalized. So it just reminds us we're a small open economy and any sort of global headlines will most likely affect us.
Kwena Maloko, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. From Equity Research Sales at Absa CIB with the Money Show, 6:30.
Travel is more than just ticking off countries. It's about the people, the culture, the food, the moments. I'm Pippa Hudson, and on Wonder the World, I invite you to join me every week as we explore destinations both near and far with the help of fellow adventurers who share their unique travel stories. Listen to my podcast wherever you get them.
The Money Show.
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
And DSTV channel 856.
Well, good to hear from you this evening on 011 8830702 and 0214460567. The Vukile Property Fund reporting today that it's managed to double its profits from its malls here, mostly in sort of rural areas, I suppose, and in Spain and Portugal. It's got a vacancy rate of just 1.7%. Lawrence Rapp is the CEO at the Vukile Property Fund. Lawrence, good evening. Your operations are split between here and Europe. You have low vacancy rates in both markets. How are you keeping your clients happy?
Stephen, thank you very much. I think, we have a very similar operating model in both markets, although obviously very different clients. But at the heart of it, we talk about running a consumer-led retail REIT business. In other words, we focus very much on trying to understand the shoppers in the communities in which we operate, what we need to do to bring them into our malls, stay longer, spend more money, and obviously that then drives success for our tenants. And when that happens, we're able to not only reduce vacancies, but increase rents. So clearly there are very different needs driving consumers in, say, Guguletu or Badajoz or Lisbon. But if your business is built around understanding those needs with a common model, that I think really is the golden thread that runs through our business across the different geographies that we operate in.
Here in South Africa, you had big increases in your trading density growth. So it was up by 9% in township areas, up by 4.3% in rural areas, and 2.7% in urban areas. Why are you seeing more growth in some areas than in others? Is it about what other attractions there are? Is it about something else?
Yes, I think it's partly around where economic activity takes place. I think it's around, whether there are competing retail schemes or other attractions, as you put it. And very often in our township and rural markets, we are the dominant player in those areas. And therefore, we are able to drive more footfall to the mall through our promotions, through our activities that we run at the mall in order to get that. Whereas if you sort of, for example, are more in Johannesburg and you've got a choice of 5 or 6 different shopping centers to go to, well, you may then, it's harder to fight for the consumer. So what we tend to try and do is buy assets that are dominant in their catchment areas, with a very low probability of any competing centres coming in. And I think that's the balance in our portfolio, whether it is in South Africa, Spain or Portugal. It's that same operating model, and that's what drives the footfall and the growth that you're seeing.
You had some marketing campaigns around certain malls in South Africa. So in Dobsonville, you focused on the Soweto Derby, which is kind of an obvious one.
Yeah.
So, okay, I understand that in some places there's not much going on. But what kind of event in a situation like that, where there is a lot of other things going on around a Soweto Derby, gets people to come to a shopping mall?
Sure. I think those were certain examples that we pulled out. But, we've had a lot of our promotional work is around understanding the needs of the community. So we've had one, for example, in the past, a little girl, unfortunately, in Atlantis, who was suffering from cancer. We used the shopping centre as a way of raising money and building support for her. That built a very strong affinity between the community and the shopping centre. We try and look after the elderly in the communities. One very unfortunate situation at the moment is in Mthatha, where floods have claimed the lives of many people, and we're trying to use the shopping centre to help and support where we can. So really what we're trying to do is to say, how do we understand what's really important, what's driving the community that we operate in? I'll go further afield into Spain, where it's a very different scenario as to what the social issues are. There has been a big focus on abandoned animals. That is something that the community resonates with, and that's what we have, been trying to promote. So really, it's a model that is driven by the shopping centre management team to understand and execute locally what we then sort of, drive at a central level in terms of philosophy.
Your biggest costs are municipal and electrical, and in South Africa they amount to, I think it's 46% of all your costs. I mean, it's a big category. And obviously you've tried to reduce that as much as possible. You've got solar where you can. I imagine that's still going on. But in some places, are problems in municipality a major risk? So you have a big new centre in Mthatha. If you have sort of a big local government failure, that must pose a risk to some of your malls. I mean, to businesses everywhere, but to some of your malls too.
Sure. I think the one issue that we talk about a lot is service delivery, more specifically the lack of service delivery, and the fact that we expect better of our local municipalities. But I think the way that one manages that is through active engagement and through diversification. What I mean, active engagement is how well do we engage with the local municipality to understand, again, the local environment, to stress the centrality of our shopping centre to the community that we operate in, and then diversification. So we're now sitting with 50 billion rand worth of assets, 35% in South Africa. That's split across 33 different properties, 65% in Spain and Portugal, split across 21 properties. So I think, if one is trying to find a no-risk environment, sitting with cash under the mattress is always an option, but that's not the business we're in. I think the way we can manage it is by having diversification across geography, across property, across tenants, and across the boxes, in other words, the tenants that we have. So the point that you make is exceptionally valid, and one that we take very seriously, and one that we try and work very closely with the local government on. But I think diversification is a very effective way of mitigating and managing that risk, together with that very close engagement with the council, and to try and make ourselves, in many respects, as independent as we can. But then coming back to your earlier questions, as indispensable to the community as possible, so the community feels a sense of ownership and responsibility towards them all. Because certainly no municipality would want to upset their electorate by impacting a mall negatively.
Lawrence Rapp, thanks so much, CEO of the Vukile Property Fund. What makes you go back to a shopping mall? Is it that sense of community? Is it just they have the easiest parking? Is there something else? 011 88 30702 021 446 0567. I know what it is for me, I'll tell you that.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Well, on Youth Day yesterday, you heard about a new report suggesting younger people see money, I suppose, differently to the way generations before them have. And I do think different generations have different experiences and aspirations with money. But one of the most important changes in the last, I suppose, 10 years, but really in the last 5 years, has been the number of people who are investing directly. There's so many different platforms now that allow you to invest directly on the JSE or in crypto or in all sorts of places. Zihad Israfil is the CEO of CFI South Africa. Zihad, good evening. Thanks for the time. I mean, it's easier to invest now and to invest directly than it's ever been. How has this changed so quickly in the last 10 years?
Good evening, Stephen, and thank you very much for having me. Look, Stephen, it has certainly changed. You know, we look at millennials and we look at Gen Z. You know, they are investing much younger, often from the age of 19, I would say. You know, and they want platforms that are mobile, they want it to be easy to use, and of course tailored to their goals. So they're not just looking at returns, but they're looking and care about values too. So things like sustainability and transparency, which is key. You know, we also find that they expect bite-sized, engaging type of content to really learn from, not long manuals. So we at CFI, we responded with this with personalized tools, educational content, and even AI-driven features, you know, that makes the experience far more smart and more aligned with what this new generation expects.
So, I mean, people want that. If you buy something on Temu or Shin, it's like playing a game. It doesn't always lead to the wisest decision. I'll come to that in a moment. But I presume people also want it to be cheap and they want it to be quick.
Indeed. Absolutely. You know, and that's why you need to have features and, of course, functionalities that are, of course, most in demand, you know. So what's important and key is to have a platform that is educational as well as mobile friendly and, of course, transparent. And we at CFI, we see a lot of demand for learning tools as well, you know, risk assessment features like interactive quizzes and a variety of other things. So we've built this all into our platform to meet those evolving needs.
There must be some risks to this. I mean, it's easier to invest. It's easier to lose money too than it's ever been.
Absolutely. You know, easy access is great, as I say, but it can also mean that people jump in without really understanding, especially when influenced, you know, by the hype of social media. And that's why we at CFI, we've really taken a very strong stand, Stephen, on education and transparency. You know, we have something like Trading Transparency Plus and the CFI Academy, which really guides the trader from day one, which allows them to make a more informed choice rather than what we call an emotional one.
So I suppose the real test of this approach is probably whether you end up with more money in 20 years than you would, you know, using your platform or a traditional platform. We're often told by people, you may know, we have our own personal finance person, Warren Ingram, and he often will say, don't chop and change. You know, pick a strategy, stick with it. And that's what people have done for many, many years. I mean, things are different now. I understand that's hard. But is that still good advice? I mean, should we be moving our investments as much as your platform allows us to? Or should we still actually be sticking with what we kind of know? You know, I mean, Capitec's been Capitec for a long time now.
Yeah, look, Stephen, you know, it all depends what your goal is, really, right? But it's important to make an informed decision and ensure that where you're investing is really going to reach your target goal, you know, and that's why it's important to obviously use something like education to help you to make an informed decision at the end of the day. And education for us has been a core part of our platform. You know, again, we offer something called the CFI Trading Academy, which is everything from basic to advanced trading courses. We also have something called Trading Transparency Plus, which helps traders understand their own risk profile. You know, with a tool like the Trading Reality Check. So it's all about building long-term and informed decisions that have been made and not just chasing a quick win.
Zihad Israfil, thanks very much indeed. CEO at CFI.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025.
We've been talking about shopping centres a little bit, and I'm quite keen to hear from you on what makes you go back to a shopping centre, what makes you stay away from a shopping centre. I mean, in 3 words, mine is parking, parking, parking. And, you know, sometimes I go to a shopping centre, and I'm kind of quite happy to name and shame, debating whether I should or not. And you sort of get there and you just know this is going to be a disaster. You want to pop in and get something, it's not going to happen. And you now start to do other things, you know, you avoid that shopping centre. But I just find in some ways, so there's parking is the one thing. The second is making you pay for it after a short stay. I mean, just do an hour free. I mean, I realize that you make money from parking. I understand that. But sometimes I just think it's just not worth the hassle. And yes, I know there are apps, I use some of them, that make parking easier and quicker and relatively cheap and all the rest. There's got to be a better way than a machine that prints out a little piece of paper that you will lose. I mean, it's just, and you know, I bumped into many people socially who do many different things. I've bumped into someone who works in the parking industry once in my whole life. And somebody said, oh, she works in the parking industry. And I said, oh, I hear you work in the parking industry. And she said, yes, and literally walked away from me. So I think she knew what was coming. But it just means, come on, find a different way to do things. Got to be a better way. And I mean, yes, apps and all the rest, they work. But you can't force everyone onto them, but there's got to be a better way. Plenty coming up in the next little while. We'll be talking about beneficiation during the green transition and how important that is for us. Also updating you on what's happening on our continent. And then don't forget personal finance this evening. Are you ready for a financial emergency? Looking forward to that conversation. You with The Money Show. It's just gone 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, powering Africa's potential from ground to grid, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025. I wonder if you've given much thought to financial emergencies. And one emergency, it's amazing how most emergencies eventually become a financial emergency in some way, shape or form. Eventually you need money for this, you need money for that. Or worse, several happen at the same time. It's never 2 or 4, it's always 3. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Well, Warren Ingram will be focusing on that in a little while. Looking forward to that conversation in personal finance this evening. How you prepare for that. He's got some really good ideas. We'll talk about the global energy transition in just a moment. And then also getting some updates on what's happening around the world, around our continent. We'll speak to Rotendo Ndwingwi, as always, keeping a very close eye on that for us.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
Green economy. For years, you'll have heard politicians making the point that we need to stop just mining and taking minerals out of the ground and selling them, but we need to beneficiate them here. Now there's a suggestion that, in fact, this is the best time to do it. The transition to renewable power might give some more of that give all of that some more urgency, and particularly because so many of the minerals you need for that to run, solar plants, to run windmills, all of those things, they're needed they're actually under the ground here. Muzi Kobeka is the director in the banking and finance and project finance, energy and infrastructure team at CMS South Africa. Muzi, good evening. We've been talking about beneficiation in South Africa for years. Why is it suddenly more important now?
Firstly, good evening, and thank you very much for having me on. It's an opportune time to discuss this topic, largely because what we're speaking about now, what is topical, is the just energy transition and issues like decarbonization. And when you speak about critical minerals, amongst other things, you're talking about minerals such as platinum group metals, manganese, vanadium, that are vital for sectors like electric vehicles, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing. They also go into things like cell phone batteries, laptop batteries, and the like. So this is something that is currently topical.
What do we need to do that? I mean, we worry about deindustrialization. Do we need to make sure that we actually reindustrialize? Smelters are quite crucial to that, aren't they?
Yes, because amongst other things, there is an interesting intersection between critical minerals in the sense of mining and energy in the sense of electricity production and distribution. As you said in your introduction, a lot of these minerals, they go into, for instance, the manufacture of solar panels and other components required for solar plants. They also go into what you need for wind energy projects. So that is what makes them, interesting. And the issue here is we also need to be clear about what we mean by beneficiation, because some of the things that are spoken about are that critical minerals and the just energy transition can drive the reindustrialization of the country while supporting decarbonization and modernizing the economy. So, in my view and in my experience, one of the things that you need practically is to have legal certainty so that you can encourage private investment in the beneficiation of these critical minerals. And quite clearly and quite obviously, what this means is we need to have a clear legal definition of what beneficiation means. And why this is topical is that there has been a publication of the Mineral Resources Development Amendment Bill, which seeks to make certain amendments to the existing Mineral Resources and Petroleum Development Act to give effect to what we're talking about. And I'm happy to go into further detail on that.
No, sure. I mean, we've covered that in some detail. Some of it's been taken out, some of it's still there. But you're suggesting the way that this has been unveiled, and also, if I may just add to it, the sort of confusion around it, because first there was a demand that someone who wanted a prospecting right would have to have an empowerment partner. That's now been removed. That was late last week. Just the confusion around it must work against investment too, at a time when clearly we need it for beneficiation.
Absolutely, which is why I started my response by pointing towards legal certainty. However, what we need to bear in mind is that this is a bill that is currently open for public comment until August this year. So part of how we as a society and as stakeholders make legislation work is by being active citizens and providing comments and pointing out where legislation could potentially have shortcomings. If I recall correctly, the bill was published in May and there was a correction issued in June. And in part, that is a reaction to commentary and input from the mining industry. So part of how you make legislation work is by commenting and pointing out where the shortfalls are, because the purpose of the legislation is to balance the different interests of the disparate stakeholders.
Is there a little bit of a catch-22? We need to use smelters to make the things that will help us generate electricity in a green way, but first we need electricity to run our smelters. I mean, this requires some clever policy.
It does require clever policy, and where it gets a little bit tricky is in the sense that smelters are intensive users of electricity. And in the main, they need to run 24/7. And the issue with renewable energy, which obviously produces far less emissions than fossil fuels, in particular coal, is that it's intermittent in nature. So a solar plant will only produce power when the sun is shining. Likewise, a wind project only produces electricity when there's wind. So what is happening from a technology perspective, for instance, there are advances being made in battery technology under the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. Preferred bidders have just been announced on the BESS projects, because the battery energy storage projects, that is what BESS means, they allow a solar plant to operate for an extended period by also charging the battery while generating electricity during the day. So it's a balance of advances in technology and also policy.
Muzi Kubeka, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Director in the banking and finance and project finance, energy and infrastructure team at CMS South Africa.
702. Stephen is on X
at Stephen Grootes.
Well, having a look at what's happening on our continent, Dr. Rutendo Hundwengwi is the founding director of Tribe Africa Advisory, author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Rutendo, good evening. Good to chat again. The World Bank, they're spending some money on this Inga Dam scheme in the DRC. Isn't it quite controversial?
Controversial from a number of angles. And good evening to you, Stephen, and to your listeners. So just to give context, the Inga Dam is on the west side of on the west side of the DRC, so closer to Congo Brazzaville. One of the key things about the DRC, they're going through a war that's happening on the east side, closer to Goma, and that's about 3,000 kilometers difference. So it just gives context in terms of the size of the land. But coming back to the Inga Dam, the initial injection that the World Bank has put in place is about $250 million. The total investment they're going to make is $1 billion. And the frightening thing, Stephen, the actual cost of the dam is going to be billions of dollars. This investment by the World Bank is just for preliminary work. So why there's controversy, Stephen, before I get into the details of the dam itself and what it will produce, is that on one side, the biodiversity people are saying, because they're going to build the dam, the natural forestation, the number of things will be destroyed, the fisheries, and that's their concern. But the World Bank is saying that by building the dam, they'll actually save a lot of the rainforest, because a lot of the rainforest, rainforests have been used to produce charcoal as a source of electricity. So if they build the dam, it produces hydroelectric power. So that's where it's coming from. The dam itself, Stephen, is going to be up to 42 gigawatts. It's probably going to take about 5 to 10 years estimate to build. But looking at the Ethiopian Renaissance, the dam, the one that happened in Ethiopia, which was close to the DRC, that took about 14 years, Steve. So there's a lot of controversy around it. And obviously in the bigger scheme of global geopolitics and economics, yes, obviously electricity is absolutely critical. The DRC, just to give you another figure, Stephen, at the moment, 21% of the population has no electricity. That's about 80 million people in the DRC. And one of the big visions of the AFDB with the World Bank is Mission 300, which is that whole initiative to provide electricity to 3 million people in Africa by 2030. So a lot of dynamic parts, a lot of controversy, a lot of discussions. And at the end of the day, the interesting thing is that's Africa for you. As much as there are threats, there are also opportunities, and it's how you navigate and capitalize on these in terms of succeeding on the continent, Stephen.
And then Orange Middle East and Africa, they've signed this big deal with Rising SUD. What's that?
Rising SUD, Stephen, is an agency from, and I'm really experimenting with my French here, Provence Alpes Côte. But in short terms, it's a province in France, and that province has made initiatives in terms of stimulating tech startups in Africa. The France community, and it's a part in southern France, has over 500,000 companies. And it's quite a vast and growing tech ecosystem. And what they've done is they've identified some startups in Africa through what they call their network. It's called the Orange Data Network or Center of Networks. And what it does, it creates an ecosystem of African startup entrepreneurs in the tech startup space that need stimulation, obviously from a financial mentoring perspective, business support perspective, and they open them up to European markets. So what is also interesting, Stephen, is that when you look at the startup or the Africa startup market or fund investment, if you track it and use the Partech report, which is one I usually read and go through, you will see for 2024, funding for tech startups was about $3.2 billion, which was a drop of 7% from the prior year. The global startup funding is at about $313 billion and 180 billion goes to the US. So the point here is that such initiatives are contributing in terms of stimulating the startup community of Africa, especially in the tech startup space. So it's a great gesture. It also just shows you how France is still now playing the African space, but playing a more strategic role because in this way, obviously, they open up and grow tech startups from Africa into the European market. But at the same time, they gain from the skills that they're bringing to the market. So it's a win-win and different from the former structure of trade-off that was there in the African space with regards to Europe. So a nice story with regards to stimulating economic growth and equipping tech startups on the African continent.
And then in Ghana, they've lost, is this right, 11 billion rand to gold smuggling, and somehow the UAE is involved.
Yeah. So it reminds me of the gold mafia story in Zim. But this $11 billion, Stephen, is over 5 years. The irony of it, they've lost $11 billion, and I'll give you a bit of insight in terms of what triggered that a few years ago, in terms of gold smuggling, which has gone through the UAE, and this is primarily sourced out of artisanal miners. The irony is that last year, Ghana actually exported $11 billion worth of gold. It's one of the leading gold producers on the continent. But you know the scary thing, Stephen, Ghana's GDP $77 billion at the moment. Obviously, it's not at its strongest. So $11 billion is 14% of their GDP. So it's quite a substantial amount. Just to add some more stats, the research showed that 229 metric tons of gold were unaccounted for when they looked at imports versus exports of gold. And one of the reasons why this whole saga happened, Stephen, was that a few years ago, Ghana put a withholding tax of 3% on any gold exports that were going out of the country. And that automatically sort of triggered or fueled the smuggling community of gold out of the country. They reduced it to 1.5 and they realized they're not solving the problem. And now they're down to, they've totally scrapped off that whole investment or that whole initiative with regards to taxing artisanal gold leaving the country. So a lot of lessons to be learned there. But I think the sad thing for me, Stephen, and I'm also reflecting on what happened with the Zimbabwean scenario, is that we put a lot of pressure and accountability on the countries that are producing the gold in terms of smuggling out. But also, I think a lot more can be done in terms of the recipient countries that are receiving the gold. I think one of the key things that came out of this report, Stephen, is that people who go with handheld gold into the UAE, whether you carry it in your purse, as long as it's not heavy, you don't have to account for it. So there are a lot of loopholes in the global and bigger economic system in the world with regards to putting a clamp down on this. But at the end of the day, $11 billion out of a country like Ghana is going to make significant negative impact. And it will take more than just Ghana itself in terms of resolving this issue.
And then Morocco, we've got a minute left. Morocco is boosting its desalination project. And I've always thought that we're going to have a lot more desalination around our continent at some point.
Yeah, so Morocco, what's driving this is going through quite a serious drought. So they're building a lot of desalination plants all over their country. They've currently had about 17, to convert salt water to drinking water. They're looking to build another 13, so that will be 13 total. And they're looking to produce about 1.7 billion cubic meters of water over the next few years. Their dams at the moment are at about 39.2, so they're facing a huge challenge in terms of getting water out. But the irony of it, Stephen, is that their exports of fresh produce to Europe have actually increased significantly. And this is because of access to underground water. So they've been quite innovative. And I think that's the thing about Morocco. They are so dynamic in terms of how they think and how they adapt to problems in Africa and how they navigate. And they're in the midst of these problems, they're creating great solutions.
Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Rotendo Ndwingi, the founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory and author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Fascinating to see how desalination is becoming a much bigger thing. Rotendo, thanks very much.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
This personal finance feature is brought to you by Indware Risk Services, because the right insurance starts with a conversation. It starts with Hello Indwe. Well, Warren Ingram, as you know, is a certified financial planner at Galileo Capital. Tonight, we're talking about financial emergencies and how to prepare for them. Warren, good evening. I'm not going to ask what inspired this tonight, but a financial emergency is something that's inevitable and it will happen to all of us.
Absolutely right, Stephen. And I think it's, we just have to look around the world and see that, financial emergency can happen to us. It can literally fall out the sky in some instances. And if we're not prepared, the problem with a financial emergency is it doesn't really hang around going, I'll wait for you until you're ready. It just happens, and very often happens when you're least prepared and least able to deal with them. So tonight we're talking about taking the steps to fix that.
I've always found that actually the worst times are not when one thing happens. It's usually in threes, but the geyser goes, then there's a bumper bashing, and then there's something else. The roof starts leaking or something. And that's actually, you don't realize it at the time, but it's the three of them together that constitute the emergency because they all cost money.
It sounds to me like you're a new homeowner going through some financial trauma there, Stephen. I hear it. I hear the pain. It's real, and you're right. We can probably deal with one or two issues, maybe just from our own resources. But at the moment, it's a bigger item, so something that really derails us, or an accumulation of small items, then we're in a position where we're going to either have to take debt, or we're going to, and that debt that we're going to be forced to take at that moment in time is what's available to us very quickly. And debt that's available to you at very short notice is usually the most expensive form of debt you can find. And so we're in a position where we either have to do that, or we have to sell things that are valuable to us. And the things that you can sell that are most valuable are the ones that can be traded very quickly, are probably the things you really shouldn't be selling. So you're right. We have this big issue that just sort of arrives on us, and it happens to us. And inevitably, when you talk to people sort of later in their careers, or potentially in retirement, they'll tell you these kinds of things just crept up on them. And then all of a sudden, it was a series of small little problems that just compounded and got them really stuck. And that's the thing we don't want to happen to people.
Okay, so an emergency fund is the obvious answer. Most of us have some form of debt, and we're putting any money that we have extra into that. How then should you start an emergency fund at the same time?
I think maybe it's a case of taking a small step in one direction and then pivoting and fixing the debt for a while, and then going back to the emergency fund. So for example, I think an ideal size emergency fund is somewhere around 3 to 6 months worth of your expenses. And that, for most of us, would constitute the kind of biggest financial emergency that we would need to fund from our own resources. But if you're sitting there with especially short-term debt like credit cards, personal loans, overdrafts, those kinds of things, and no emergency fund, then it's obvious that you need to spend as much of your money as you possibly can on getting that debt paid down as quickly as you can. But at the same time, you've still got no powder left dry to take care of the emergency that might be happening. So the answer then is start, make sure that you're always paying off the debts, those debts, at least the minimum amount that you're required to pay on a monthly basis. But then start building up the emergency fund. My suggestion, depending on how big your expenses are, is maybe just set a target. Go for the first 10,000 Rand of what your emergency fund should be. So let's say you spend 20,000 Rand a month, then you would know that your emergency fund should be somewhere around 20 times 3. So what's that? 60,000 to 120,000 is really what you're aiming for, but you're not going to get there very quickly. So at the start, just build up that emergency fund of 10,000 Rand. Once you've got that, you've got some peace of mind that if something goes wrong, and it's not a huge amount, at least you've got some money available to take care of a smaller emergency. And then you go flat out on knocking your short-term debts as fast as you can. And I think that the trick there is it might take you 2 or 3 years to get rid of those short-term debts. So at least being able to let that emergency fund sit idle and maybe grow a little bit while you're doing that should give you some sort of protection.
We do need to discuss emergency. Kaizer Chiefs actually getting into the final of something and tickets being available might be an emergency. You do need to think about that quite carefully.
I think quite a few people were having conversations with themselves or their spouses when they suddenly realized that South Africa has a fairly decent chance of beating Australia in the World Test Championship and figuring out whether they could get plane tickets overnight to get to watch the last couple of days, and that unfortunately doesn't constitute an emergency. So to me, an emergency, you categorize it in a couple of ways. One, it must be something that is dramatically affecting your and your loved ones' lives. So in other words, if you need a car to get to work every day and your car's broken down, I would say that's an emergency. And equally, I guess an obvious one would be a medical crisis where potentially your medical aid is not covering an important medical cost, or someone's sick in your family and you need to look after them. Clearly, that's an emergency. And then kind of much more mundane would be, the geyser bursts at home and you might have insurance, but your insurance company says, look, we're not doing anything until you pay the excess, the initial part of the claim. And your house can't function, it can't be repaired without that initial excess. So for me, those are real emergencies. And understanding that there are things that are urgent and important. A predictable event is not an emergency. In other words, if you know that you might need to replace your car in 2 or 3 years' time, that's very important. It's something you should start to plan for and make a financial commitment every month to deal with that. But that's not why you have an emergency fund. And the reality is, if you use your emergency fund to look after buying a new car, most likely the very next day after you've committed all that money and bought the new car is when the geyser bursts and you've got no financial resources to pay for the excess. Those are the kinds of situations that you have the emergency fund for. So important, urgent, and not predictable. I know it sounds really basic, but when we're dealing with this stuff, we need to give ourselves some ground rules for what we're planning for and deal with those in a systematic way in the middle of a crisis. Unfortunately, none of us make great decisions when we're under financial or other stress.
No, of course. I mean, and part of this is also a sort of spending plan. You need to know where money is going now, right? So you kind of know what an emergency would be.
True, and equally, I mean, it's an assumption, but I think it's probably a safe one. If you're listening and you're saying to yourself, well, I've got quite a bit of debt and I've got no emergency fund, no real plan for what to do if something goes wrong from here, then there's probably a fairly safe assumption that you don't really know where your money's going every month. And if you have to start to understand that, it starts to help you make better decisions with your money. So step one in a situation like this is track what you're spending. Actually look at your bank statements every month for the last few months and see where the money is going. I think understanding where it's gone allows you to start making some better decisions. And note, I'm not saying you can't spend money. I'm not saying that you have to now live like a hermit on a hill and have no fun and no enjoyment in life. That's not the deal. But it's just getting a really good grip on what's actually going on with the way that you spend. And then you can start to make some informed decisions to say, what's important to me, for example, might be a weekend away every now and then. So I'm not going to compromise on that. But gee, I realize I'm spending 300 or 400 rand a day on very nice coffees all around town, and actually I can make a really nice coffee at home and put it in a nice thermos flask or whatever it is, a travel cup, and travel with nice coffee. I don't need to spend the money on that. And very quickly, by just looking at what's happened over the last few months of your expenses, you start to figure out where your money is being wasted and where it's really adding value in life. I think really important to me, Stephen, is if you're in a relationship, your best chance of success is not doing this in isolation. It has to be something that you do as a team. Having talked to couples for many decades, the couples that achieve financial freedom and that have some kind of financial success, the one thing they do is that they plan together. I'm not saying that one person's in control of the other person's money. It's not a control issue. It's about joint goals and then holding each other accountable and helping each other when times get tough and someone's finding it a bit depressing because they haven't had to be able to buy that extra coffee that they really wanted or whatever the deal is. But do this together and don't do it in isolation. It doesn't help.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, relationships, you really need to have that conversation. Okay, so if you're in a position where something happens, you had to get the car fixed, the cost is huge, and you can't actually repay it now, what should you do?
I think it's kind of a terrifying situation. I think a lot of people find themselves in a position where they're terrified to open the banking app. They certainly don't look at the emails from the banks and the people to whom they owe money, because what they know is that they can't make a plan to deal with that. And so they ignore it. And the one thing you have to know about money is when you have it and it starts to grow, it compounds in your favor. But when you owe money, it's growing against you. It's compounding against you at a rapid rate, and it never goes away. The one thing you cannot do in a situation like this is ignore the money problems, because they're just simply, you can't wish them away. And so I think the thing here is don't be passive. Don't sit back and just, dread what's going on. Rather take some form of action. And let's talk about sort of really tough situations that people find themselves in. One of them is they get to a situation where they cannot afford to pay the home loan, their mortgage on a monthly basis. Now, if you're in a position like that and you're not engaging with the bank and you're not taking action to do something about it, what happens is eventually, there's quite a long legal process, but eventually what will happen is the bank will take your house. They will repossess your house and they will put it up for auction and they will sell it. And their interest is to get their money back. Their interest is not to make sure that you're in the best possible position you could be. So if you're faced with this really tough situation, don't wait. Take control and actually sell the house yourself. Get the very best price you can and then settle the debts with the bank. That means you have to find a new place to live. But either way, you're going to be stuck in that situation. If you wait, the bank's going to take your house and then you're going to need to find a place to live, possibly with a lot less money than you would have had. So rather settle your debts in that situation, take control and do something about it. The same applies to a car. If you've taken a car on an installment sale and you're not able to pay, don't let the bank repossess it and then sell it. They sell those cars in auctions, and auctions are never where you're going to get the best price. I mean, there might be great auction sites, but if you take control, you look for a really good buyer, you take care of the car and sell it, you're going to get the best possible price you can, and then settle the outstanding with the bank. In all of these situations, we're not talking about your dream scenarios here. What we're talking about is really tough choices. And if you sit back, those tough choices get made for you. And unfortunately, they're going to be much more expensive for you than you taking the decision.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's always so often in life, isn't it? You have to actually face it head on. So absolutely. Personal finance this evening with Warren Ingram. We have a question from Jonathan. Hi, what are actively managed ETFs and should I consider buying them? That's from Jonathan. Well, we'll have an answer for that for you in just a moment.
The Money Show.
Personal finance with Warren Ingram.
Warren, of course, is a certified financial planner at Galileo Capital. And Warren, we had a question from Jonathan. What are actively managed ETFs and should I consider buying them?
So I think we've got to do a little bit of de-jargoning here and a little bit of history to answer the question for Jonathan. So when we're talking about something like this, what we're talking about is a type of investment. And originally when they came to South Africa, ETFs were revolutionary. They had been around for a while overseas, but what happened was we found a share that was listed on the stock exchange that allowed us to buy the top 40 shares in South Africa. And that was the first exchange-traded fund. So that's what it stands for. ETF is exchange-traded fund. And it was very innovative because instead of me having to go and buy all 40 shares at once and paying huge amounts of brokerage and all the admin involved in trying to track the 40 biggest companies on the JSE, I could simply buy one thing, and that one thing would actually end up owning, those 40 shares in proportion and allow me to get the benefit of the 40 biggest companies going up, hopefully, or even going down, and all the dividends that they pay, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a revolutionary form of investment. The idea at the time was exchange-traded funds would be a lot cheaper than, for example, their unit-trust competitors, which were at the time a lot more expensive than an exchange-traded fund. And I could transact in them in relatively small amounts. I could open a stockbroking account and buy an exchange-traded fund for probably 50 or 100 or 200 rand or whatever the amount was, without any ongoing contract. I could do what I wanted. And anything like that, which is innovative, that actually attracts huge investor interest, will attract a lot of product provider interest. And that's what we found, was suddenly a bunch of product providers started to launch more and more forms of exchange-traded funds. And all the time, we had the unit trust industry looking at this with relative, initially probably a little bit of bemusement, but after a while, a bit of fear and concern, because a lot of the time, these exchange-traded funds were taking money away from unit trusts. And so unit trusts started to get a bit cheaper, and their big competitive advantage was you could buy unit trusts where you would have a fund manager deciding what to buy and sell within that fund, and the idea being that they would do better than the stock market, or they could have a balanced fund where there was some cash, some bonds, some property, some shares, etc., and they could mix and match those assets in a way that they thought would be in your interests and according to some kind of a long-term benchmark. And that was something that you couldn't get in an exchange-traded fund. So, of course, the industry doesn't stand still. So what they did, the exchange-traded fund industry, was look at this and say, well, hang on, why don't we launch our version of let's say, a balanced unit trust or an actively managed unit trust in the form of an exchange-traded fund? And that's where we are today. I think somewhere around 2022, we saw the first ones being approved in South Africa. I think they're listed in 23. There's certainly more than 20 of them now, and I think it's a growing part of the industry. So the answer to Jonathan's question is, they're interesting to look at. They might have some cost benefits, but it's going to, I think what matters really is not whether you should buy them as a whole class of investment, but what you're actually looking for. So if you're looking for an actively managed investment and you want to trade in a very small amount and you want to own it via a stockbroking account, then perhaps an actively managed ETF is a good idea for you. But if you want to own it inside a retirement fund or something like that, then you might want to look at the unit trust. So unfortunately, the industry has made a lot of complexity now out of what used to be very simple investments. And so it's going to be tricky for you, Jonathan, to look at this and say, yes, the answer is I should, or no, the answer is I shouldn't. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to sit on the fence a little bit on this one and say it's really going to depend on your needs. You need to do your homework on the costs. With an exchange-traded fund, you buy them, so you're paying a transaction fee, and when you sell them, you're paying a transaction fee. So those are different to a unit trust where you don't pay transaction fees. But the exchange-traded fund might be a little bit cheaper on an annual basis with asset management fees relative to the unit trust. So you will need to do your homework on this. And I suspect for larger investors, so people that are trading in amounts of hundreds of thousands, they might find a preference for the unit trusts, whereas smaller investors might find a preference for exchange-traded funds. But I think it's going to be many sizes of shoe fitting, many kinds of investors. We're not going to find one answer for everybody in this one.
It's interesting to see, and I mean, you make such an interesting point about how complex the industry has become, and maybe that doesn't really help us. Let's just very quickly wrap up the sort of what to do in a financial jam. We've got a minute left. But your point, it really struck me about how important it is to take action. I mean, that's kind of something that you really have to do. You've got to take one small step and follow it up with another, and actually one day you'll look behind you and see how much progress you've made.
Exactly right. So those, that compounding problem with money can be resolved. You can allow compounding to work for you. So if you're listening to this and you're terrified and you're stuck, the way to unstick yourself from this situation is take one action, do one thing, go and draw your bank statements online and just start to look at what you're doing. That's the thing you do today. Tomorrow, look at what you can cut. The day after, start to cut. That's maybe the first 3 steps you can follow. And then talk to a trusted person that you know that can help you look at these things a bit more objectively. But don't just sit there and let it go against you. It's a terrible place to be.
Warren Ingram, thank you so much. Co-founder of Galileo Capital and, of course, with personal finance this evening, a certified financial planner.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025.
Well, of course, markets still watching the situation in the US. Donald Trump not adding to peace, I'm afraid. It would seem it seems almost like threats against the supreme leader of Iran. The Dow Jones is down 0.5%, the Nasdaq down 0.6%, the S&P 500 down 0.55%. And of course, we'll have more for you on that tomorrow. But that conflict between Iran and Israel is the thing to watch at the moment, I suspect. That's it from The Money Show. Back tomorrow. Good night.